As you have heard before, this event is co-sponsored by the International Migration Research Center at Wilfrid Laurier. And each speaker will have 10 minutes, and then we'll follow by a 10-minute question period at the end. I believe our first speaker will be Margaret Walton-Roberts, Associate Professor at BSEI, and Dr. Walton-Roberts is a human geographer whose focus research is on Indian immigration, transnational migrant networks, and immigration to Canada. Second speaker, I believe is the organizer of today's expert panel, is Dr. Jenna Henneberry, Director of the International Migration Research Center and Associate Professor at Balsley School of International Affairs. Our third speaker is Jonathan Crash, chairing Global Migration at the Center for International Governance and Innovation, CIGI, and professor at the Balsley School. And I believe we don't have sorry, Dr. Alison Mons. Yeah, and our fourth speaker is Dr. Alison Mons, as the Canada Research Chair in Global Migration, and is Associate Professor at the Balsley School of International Affairs. And actually, Dr. Mons' work explores the tensions between the decisions and desires that drive human migration and the policies and practices designed to manage immigration. So please welcome to the panel. Each presenter will have 10 minutes, and then we'll have the questions. Thank you very much.
And thank you to Rajan for opening the session up with this his great talk. And we'd like to pick up on some of those themes and also come at the idea of global governance of migration from different perspectives. And so each of us on this panel will talk to this issue from a slightly different perspective. And so I'll begin, and really one of the things that I'm interested about in terms of the kind of global governance of migration is really to think about one of the things that Rajan highlighted in his talk, which is the way in which migration policy is kind of interpreted by various governments as opposed to their interests on migration as a development agent. And so what I want to do is kind of think about that new trajectory that many governments are interested in, which is to look at the diasporas as development agents and try and put that in relation to the debate that that's currently happening and circulating around the notion of the global governance of migration. So certainly many migration scholars are aware of the fact that international migration is one of the few processes that has not been subjected to an international regime framework to the same degree as other practices such as trade, financial exchange, human rights, security, and even the internet. And so in terms of immigration, one of the early kind of global approaches, if we could call it that, to address this issue were things like the Global Commission on International Migration, which was established in 2003. But even looking at these kinds of initiatives, when we look at the work of people like Alexander Betts, he suggests that global migration governance, which can be kind of described as the norms embedded in institutions that deal with migration, and he identifies that even though we don't have this kind of institutional international framework, there are many ways in which we can find the kind of emergence of forms of global governance, in that there are these kinds of somewhat, these incipient, nascent agreements around things. And so, for example, he talks about the thin multilateralism that you find in some cases, and also how migration is embedded in various institutions, for example, with like GATS agreements, where we have a kind of a service agreement. And so that's a way in which elements of migration policy are embedded in kind of trade policy. And he also talks about regional consultative processes, and this is where regional governments have a group interest and start debating and bringing in issues of migration. And Alexander Betts, for example, looks at the Global Forum on Migration and Development as a form of a kind of internationalized regional consultative process, because that global forum that Kofi Annan kind of encouraged the development of brings together governments that have a similar interest, but it's outside of the UN institutional framework. And so there's a feeling for those governments that they can have these kinds of conversations, but they're not necessarily held to them. And so it becomes somewhat more palatable for them from a political sense. And so certainly some of the research that I've been doing, which is looking at the issue of diasporas and development, I mean, it intersects with this issue of the global governance of migration, because it is a forum that is possibly one of the more active ones, where migration issues are brought up to that scale of the global, and they are engaged with in this kind of dialogical forum where people are exchanging ideas. And so I'm kind of interested in this issue, and it certainly was the UN under Kofi Annan pushed it primarily because of the issue of remittances that Rajan highlighted. So both sending and receiving governments had an interest in thinking through this development role of migrants that was becoming so kind of evident, if you like, through the work that the World Bank and the IMF were doing in capturing that data. And I think, again, Rajan's talk did a nice job of highlighting that in many policy contexts, it's the remittance data that's almost some of the most reliable data. But then, of course, scholars who look at remittances argue that that's not really reliable either. But in fact, what they say, if anything, it underreports the value of remittances. So it's really the flows of capital that have drawn the attention of governments to kind of discuss this at the global level, to discuss the migration that is the root of those particular flows of capital. But nonetheless, that then leads us into what is currently going on globally, which is a very keen interest in migration for development. And this is coming out in such venues as the World Bank's Knowledge for Migration for Knowledge initiatives, where they are actively looking at how migration can be parlayed into development agendas. And it's also linked to the USA's led dialogue Ideas, which is looking at develop diasporas as kind of economic agents, and those kind of global agendas are placing migration on that discussion board, but they're coming at it from a somewhat different perspective, because in many ways what this kind of dialogue is doing is asking, how can we kind of extract the maximum from the migrants in some ways? And so the development agenda is asking about what impact can remittances have? How can we use diasporas to promote things like entrepreneurialism and volunteerism and innovation, as opposed to saying, what are some of the barriers that are preventing these people from moving in the first place, and what are some of the barriers that might prevent these folks from maximizing their development potential? And so one of the things I would argue is that we have a particular kind of global dialogue that's going on around diasporas as development agents, but it's a particular dialogue that is almost orchestrated in some ways as a very sort of neoliberal discussion and debate. And there are many other scholars who have kind of engaged with this problematic as something that we should be kind of thinking about as critical migration scholars. And so with that in mind, I just want to highlight 3 points of consideration for researchers who are interested in these issues, and particularly who are engaged in the idea of diasporas as development agents, to just contemplate and think about as we look at what agencies like the World Bank and the Global Forum on Migration and Development and Ideas, which is led by USAID and the State Department from the US, as those kind of policy ideas get out there, let's think about them. So the first one, I'll just briefly go over them, is to think about these diaspora development solutions as kind of policy mutations and circulations. And this is calling upon the work of Jamie Peck, for example, who's a geographer who's been very interested in looking at what he calls fast policy. So he traces how policy ideas get picked up from one particular geographical context and translated through kind of think tanks and professional policy activists, through some of the multilateral agencies like the World Bank, like the UN, and then get sort of distributed out to other places. So if you think about things like Global SCOT, so this is the Scottish government developed this Global SCOT program to reach out to its diasporic population, to encourage them to be investors and development agents in Scotland. So it reached out to its overseas migrant population and said, kind of come back to Scotland and invest your money. And so the World Bank picked up that Global SCOT model and tried to encourage other countries that have large immigrant populations to replicate it. Well, of course, they're completely different geographical contexts. They have completely different kinds of issues, completely different kinds of problematics that they need to solve. And so that's the first thing to think about with regards to these new kinds of policy mantras, is every time it's raised as, here's a good solution, we should always be asking ourselves those difficult questions about the context. The second point I want to highlight that is kind of brought out by this very interesting development, diasporas as development agents, is really how it raises all sorts of questions about new kinds of political geographies. So, for example, traditionally, again, one of the reasons in many ways why migration is kind of the last bastion against any kind of global governance framework is because it's so linked to territorially bounded states. But if you look at the work of people like Alan Gamlin, he's arguing that we have to stop thinking about states as territorial units and start thinking about them as institutional complexes. And when you think about a state as an institutional complex, suddenly it doesn't seem so odd to incorporate the external population. So your diasporic population is not necessarily your non-required. It's actually, it can be deeply embedded in the interests of the state. And so he calls that the kind of the emigrant state. And so those sort of new geographical imaginings that we have begin to question all kinds of political approaches to things like international relations and how we can imagine migration as part of the kind of the global processes around us. And then the final point to just think about, and this is stuff that I've written on in my work in India, is thinking about the diaspora. When it does become a development agent, there are many problematics as who benefits, who's making the changes, and to whose benefit. So again, when we think about the specific context that these changes are happening in, the role of the diaspora, the interests of the diaspora, they may align in particular kinds of ways. And so if I think of the work of people like Beverly Mullins, who's done some really interesting work in Jamaica, she's arguing that the state may look to the diaspora to help invest in Jamaica, but they're working with a particular elite component of the population, and there are particular class and gender and regional interests that are incorporated into the state agenda and others that are not. And so many other people have done work on this kind of agenda, which is to really, from a geographical perspective, is actually look on the ground and see who benefits from these kinds of activisms and these kinds of policy agendas and who doesn't. So I'll just conclude then by saying that certainly while when we think about global governance of migration, it's a complex issue, but when I look at the diaspora development debate, it strikes me as one of the most globalized dimensions that links to migration, that is actually being engaged with, and it is in many ways being approved of because of the way in which the World Bank and the UN are engaging with that discussion. And so there is that kind of taking forward of this agenda on the global scale. And so we really want to think about what that means and what happens in practice and who are the subjects that are created by those kinds of policy debates that circulate. Great, thank you.